Psychologists get a bit of a raw deal in the scientific community. They don't get the street cred of the hard scientists in physics or chemistry, and they're barely ever involved in improbable love plots with blonde waitresses who move in across the hall. But there is one domain in which psychologists equal their haughty scientific cousins: madness. Most people already know about Stanley Milgram's studies of obedience and Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, but these only scratch the surface. In 1942, LeShan had a single goal: to get kids to stop biting their nails. He was so committed to his task that he took some children to a camp in upstate New York in the hopes of putting an end to their nail biting immediately. LeShan didn't mess around with simple cognitive therapy or positive reinforcement to stop the scourge of nail biting. No, he had an altogether different way of getting into children's minds: through their dreams. So he waited for these kids to fall asleep before setting up a phonograph to play the message, "My fingernails taste terribly bitter," 50 times for 6 sets a night.
My fingernails taste terribly bitter.
How anybody got any sleep with a phonograph going is a question for another day, and why he made these kids internalize that their nails tasted bitter instead of just telling them that they shouldn't bite their nails is anyone's guess, but we'll just assume that the ability to brainwash children was his backup hypothesis. LeShan's master plan hit a snag when his trusty phonograph broke, perhaps as a form of protest. Some people would let this get the best of them and go home, but not LeShan. Instead of going back to the drawing board or back into town to buy a new phonograph, he decided that the best course of action would be to whisper the message into the children's ears while they were sleeping.
My fingernails taste terribly bitter.
In the end, 40% of children stopped biting their nails, so it worked, or maybe not. Who knows, but it is safe to assume that 100% of them sat up in bed at night, wide-eyed and sleep-deprived horror, lest the fingernail man come and visit them in their dreams. In 1920, John B. Watson wanted to know how to instill phobias in people, which makes him sound more like a Batman villain than a psychologist. He focused his tests on one little infant, Albert, who in hindsight was truly one of the most unfortunate infants to ever have his mother volunteer him for a scientific study, as foreshadowed by this picture. Watson wanted to see if he could make little Albert develop a fear of rats. First, he placed rats and other furry animals near the baby to show that little Albert did not originally fear these creatures. In the next phase of his study, he exposed Albert to a rat and then slammed a steel bar with a hammer, making a loud noise. Unsurprisingly, this practice of flinging rats around while banging metal together was a bit much for the baby. He learned to associate rats, anything furry, and presumably scientists with the loud noise, and became fearful of seeing these things even when the loud noises stopped. The study showed that phobias were learned and not innate, and that they could be associated with traumatic experiences early in life. And the field of psychology learned that letting researchers have free rein over children wasn't always the best idea, and introduced new, stricter ethics protocols that didn't allow scientists to traumatize little babies. In 1924, University of Minnesota graduate Carney Landis wanted to see if all people made the same facial expressions in response to certain emotions, which seems reasonable enough. But instead of testing emotions like happiness and contentment, he decided to go with disgust and pain, perhaps because those are the most accessible emotions in Minnesota? Anyways, Landis started off his completely serious scientific investigation by drawing lines on the faces of his subjects with a marker to more easily observe changes in expression. This in itself produced a pretty shocking result, as it transformed normal-looking members of society into frightening marionette people. To see what people looked like in pain, Landis shocked them. This would be hard to get by an ethics board today, but apparently it was no big deal in 1924. Hell, other scientists at the time were trying to create ape men by breeding humans with chimpanzees, so I guess a little electrocution was nothing to worry about. To elicit disgust, Landis had participants stick their hands into buckets of frogs. These days, scientists use standardized disgust scales and stimuli to simply have people read about disgusting scenarios, but again, this was 1924 and it was much more hardcore. After electrocuting people and making them fondle frogs, Landis got truly dark. Frustrated by the inconclusive expressions of despair, he decided to cut right to the point. And by cut, I mean cut, and by to the point, I mean demand that they behead a live rat with a scalpel. 2/3 of participants just went ahead and did it, which may seem surprising, but remember that they were just seated in front of a man who shocked them, jammed their hands into buckets of frogs, and drew lines all over their face like a lunatic. They were probably just relieved that the scalpel wasn't meant for them. And it didn't matter if the participant refused to decapitate their rat. Landis would just go ahead and do it for them, right in front of their face. I guess he had some anger issues. His name was Carney. One of his subjects was just 13 years old, in the Department of Psychology because he was suspected to be emotionally unstable. He must have made a wrong turn somewhere because he ended up in Carney's experiment. It seems unlikely that the boy's emotional instability was helped by this trip to the psych department. What did old Carney learn from his mass slaughter of rodents? That different people make different facial expressions for the same emotion. Far be it from me to devalue his contribution, but were the rats really necessary? So, there you have it, a brief history of mad science and psychology. Thankfully now we have an ethics board to protect us from these kinds of crazy ideas becoming reality. Let us know in the comments below what weird science experiments you've heard of, and like this video and subscribe to Science Ninjas for more super cool science.